All right, so today we're diving into the life and ideas of a pretty interesting guy, Otto Maria Carpeaux.
Oh yeah, he's a fascinating figure.
Yeah, a literary critic who converted to Catholicism in the 20th century, like
Yeah.
right in the thick of all the turmoil.
Yeah, pretty turbulent time to be having
Mhm.
you know, big questions about faith.
Exactly, and we're going to follow his journey from his early days as a journalist in
Huh.
Austria
Oh
and his
yeah.
exile to Brazil,
Mhm.
and ultimately back to the Catholic Church. And our guide for all of this is Carpeaux's own book, Caminos para Roma.
Paths to Rome.
Yeah, I mean, what's so captivating about his story is that it really kind of mirrors the whole upheaval of the 20th century.
Absolutely. You've got a Jewish-born intellectual
Mm.
fleeing Nazi Europe, finding refuge in Brazil,
Mhm.
and then ultimately finding solace in the Catholic faith.
Yeah, it's a story about survival, identity, the search for meaning.
In a world gone mad.
Yeah, it all starts in Vienna, where Carpeaux was born Otto Karpfen in 1900. And he had this really unique upbringing. His father was Jewish, his mother Catholic.
Wow. Talk about a crossroads of heritage.
Right, and he earned a chemistry degree from the University of Vienna, which makes his later career as a writer even more intriguing.
Yeah, like where did that come from? You know, it's like his scientific background gave him this really sharp, analytical mind.
Yeah, almost like it laid the groundwork. He became a journalist, got married in 1930, but then 1938,
Oh, yes.
the Nazi annexation of Austria.
Everything changes.
Yeah, he was forced to flee.
Yeah.
He escaped to Belgium first, then to Brazil, carrying with him letters of recommendation from prominent Catholics.
Imagine that journey, leaving everything behind, starting over in a new country.
Right. Must have been incredibly difficult. Do you think that experience influenced his eventual conversion?
Hard to say for sure, but it's clear that Carpeaux's exile had a profound impact on his thinking.
Yeah.
He wrote to a well-known Brazilian Catholic intellectual, Alceu Amoroso Lima, looking for support. But times were so tough that he ended up working on a coffee plantation.
Maparana. Wow. Talk about a change of scenery. From Vienna's intellectual circles to the fields of rural Brazil. This wasn't just a new job. This was like a complete upheaval of his life, do you think? This forced simplicity, being away from all of that intellectual stuff. Do you think that gave him time to really think about what he believed?
It's an interesting point. You know, being removed from your familiar settings, it often leads to deep introspection. Later, he moved to Rio de Janeiro in 1941, worked as a journalist and a library director.
Okay.
And it's during this time that we really see his disillusionment with leftist politics begin to grow.
So it's like this shift from external upheaval to an internal one.
Exactly.
And this is where his book, Caminos para Roma, becomes so crucial to understanding his conversion.
Absolutely.
He paints this really stark picture of the early 20th century. He calls it a world in deep crisis.
Yeah, he wasn't just talking about, personal hardship. He saw a widespread decay,
Of faith?
authority, traditional values.
And give us an example.
Well, he was concerned about this worship of youth. At the expense of wisdom, he felt like society was losing its connection to the past, to the accumulated knowledge of generations.
Oh, so he was worried about losing that connection
To tradition.
to history.
Right.
And he wasn't just concerned about the intellectual side of things. He was really troubled by the spiritual crisis.
Oh, absolutely. He saw the rise of these ideologies like materialism and determinism as undermining morality and personal responsibility.
Materialism, meaning the belief that only the material world exists.
Right. No room for the spiritual.
And determinism, that's the idea that our actions are predetermined.
Makes away free will. And in his view, erodes our sense of morality.
So he's saying that these ideologies, they provide this false sense of certainty, but ultimately they fail to fulfill that human need for something greater than ourselves.
Exactly. He was critical of what he called false idols that people turn to when they don't have genuine faith.
Like
things like science, technology, the state, even like artificial myths and ideologies that try to replace traditional religion.
So he's saying these substitutes, while they seem to promise progress and certainty, they actually lead to emptiness and despair.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And he saw this playing out in the pervasive sense of despair and the rising suicide rates of the time.
So he saw that as a real symptom
Yeah.
of this deeper crisis.
Right. He felt people were searching for meaning in all the wrong places.
But what about science? He had a scientific background himself.
That's what makes it so interesting.
How did he reconcile that with his critique of modernity?
It's tricky. While he criticized the limits of science and the dangers of what he called scientism,
which is
this belief that science can answer all of life's questions.
okay.
He also saw a glimmer of hope in the developments of modern science itself.
Really? In what way?
He noticed that modern science, despite its initial hostility towards religion, was unintentionally providing support for faith.
Huh. That's surprising. Can you give us an example?
Sure. He pointed to things like the decline of strict materialism and determinism in physics.
Okay.
He also saw the growing recognition of the limitations of scientific knowledge, especially with the development of quantum mechanics.
Interesting.
Even the resurgence of vitalism in biology, which emphasizes the life force within living organisms, resonated with his views.
So he's suggesting that when science acknowledges its own boundaries, it can actually point us back towards faith, towards the mysteries that science alone can't explain.
Exactly.
Fascinating.
And he explores these ideas in detail in Caminos para Roma. He saw the potential for science and faith to complement each other, rather than being in constant conflict.
That's a pretty nuanced perspective, especially for someone who was so critical of certain aspects of modernity.
It is.
But his critiques weren't limited to modern science. He also delved into the history of Christianity, particularly the impact of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, and that's a whole other can of worms.
And he wasn't exactly a fan of the Reformation, was he?
No, not really. He believed that the Reformation, while initially aiming to purify Christianity, had unintended consequences
Interesting.
that actually contributed to the spiritual crisis of his time.
Like what were some of his specific criticisms?
Well, he pointed to the rejection of Catholic tradition and the emphasis on individual interpretation of the Bible as key factors.
So he felt that this led to a fragmentation of Christianity,
Yeah.
a weakening of its authority, and a loss of its spiritual power.
Exactly.
So without the grounding of the church and its centuries-old traditions, Christianity becomes susceptible to all sorts of interpretations and potentially loses its core message. And he saw this happening with the rise of liberal Protestantism, which he viewed as an attempt to rationalize Christianity, stripping it of its mystical and supernatural elements.
He felt this trend further separated faith from reason, which he believed should be in dialogue with each other.
So by trying to make Christianity more palatable to the modern mind, liberal Protestantism actually weakened its essence.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
He saw this tendency to rationalize and simplify faith as a symptom of the modern world's discomfort with the mysterious and the supernatural.
And this discomfort with the supernatural also played a role in his critique of the quest for the historical Jesus, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Carpeaux saw these scholarly attempts to reconstruct the historical Jesus, often portraying him as a mere moral teacher, stripped of his divinity, as a misguided attempt to fit Jesus into a purely rational box.
Yeah, so they were trying to explain away the extraordinary with the ordinary.
Right. And that ultimately diminished the true message of Christianity.
Exactly.
This is where his deep understanding of the historical and intellectual context really shines through.
Yeah, he wasn't just offering a knee-jerk reaction. He was engaging deeply with the intellectual trends of his time.
And in Caminos para Roma, he provides specific examples of this tendency to rationalize Jesus. He mentions figures like Hermann Samuel Reimarus, who portrayed Jesus as a political revolutionary, and Heinrich Paulus, who attempted to explain away the miracles of Jesus with purely rational explanations.
So in a way, he's saying that the quest for the historical Jesus, while maybe well-intentioned, was actually a symptom of the modern world's rejection of the supernatural.
Precisely.
And this rejection for Carpeaux was at the heart of the spiritual crisis of the modern world. This all paints a pretty bleak picture of the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the early 20th century.
It does.
But Carpeaux wasn't just a critic. He was also searching for solutions, for a way out of this crisis.
He was.
And that's where his deep dive into the Catholic Church comes in.
Right.
He believed that the Church, with its long history, its tradition, its unwavering faith, and its emphasis on both reason and revelation,
It's a both and, Fran.
offered a path back to wholeness.
Yeah.
So for him, it wasn't just about adopting a set of doctrines. It was about embracing a worldview, a way of being in the world that integrated the spiritual, the intellectual, and the social aspects of human experience.
Exactly. He saw the Catholic Church as offering this comprehensive vision of life, a vision that had been lost in the fragmentation and uncertainty of the modern world.
And he wasn't just theorizing about this, he was living it. His conversion was a deeply personal journey, a journey that led him back to the faith of his mother.
And it's this journey, this grappling with the big questions of life, that makes Caminos para Roma such a compelling and relevant read, even today.
It certainly does. And it's a journey we'll continue to explore as we dive deeper. To Carpeaux's fascinating story. Okay, so we've seen how Carpeaux's life and experiences and his intellectual journey led him to this really deep critique of modernity. But his story isn't just about criticism. It's also about finding a way forward. He wasn't content with just pointing out the problem.
Yeah, he was. He was searching for solutions.
He was looking for answers.
Yeah.
And this is where his exploration of Catholicism becomes so fascinating.
That really is.
He believed that the Catholic Church, with its emphasis on faith and reason, offered a way to address the spiritual and intellectual crises of the modern world.
He saw it as a way out.
Yeah. He saw the church as more than just a religious institution today. It was almost like this living repository of wisdom, a guardian of tradition that could guide humanity through all the complexities of modern life.
That's a great way to put it. He saw it as a bridge between the past and the present, connecting us to the accumulated wisdom of centuries, while also providing a framework for understanding and responding to the challenges of the modern world.
Yeah, and this idea of tradition, it's so central to Carpeaux's thinking. He wasn't advocating for blind adherence to dogma, but he saw tradition as a valuable source of insight, a wellspring of experience that we can draw from to navigate the complexities of life.
Exactly. He saw tradition as as a living, evolving body of knowledge that's been tested and refined over generations. It's like this conversation that's been going on for centuries. And by engaging with tradition, we can participate in that conversation.
And gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and the world around us. It's like inheriting a library filled with insights from brilliant minds across history. You don't have to agree with everything you read.
Right.
But there's this wealth of knowledge just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. And Carpeaux believed that the Catholic Church was the institution that had most faithfully preserved and transmitted that heritage.
That intellectual and spiritual heritage.
Yes.
But his appreciation for tradition didn't mean he rejected the modern world altogether.
No, not at all.
He was still very much engaged with the intellectual currents of his time.
Absolutely. He was a voracious reader.
Yeah.
Deeply familiar with all sorts of thinkers.
Okay.
Philosophers, scientists, psychologists, artists from across the spectrum.
He was like a sponge.
He really was.
Soaking it all up.
He didn't shy away from engaging with modern thought. He saw the church as offering a way to critically engage with it without being swept away.
Without losing yourself.
Exactly.
He makes a really interesting point about the relationship between faith and reason. He doesn't see them as opposing forces, but as complementary ways of understanding reality.
Absolutely. He believed that faith and reason could and should work together, that each had something unique to offer.
So it's not either, it's both hand.
Exactly.
And he criticizes what he called rationalism, which is the belief that reason alone can provide all the answers.
And he saw that as a limited, ultimately unsatisfying way of approaching the world.
It leaves out too much.
It does.
And he also saw limitations in what he called irrationalism. He wasn't saying that we should just embrace the irrational or reject reason altogether.
Right.
It was about finding a balance.
The middle path.
Integrating faith and reason into a harmonious whole.
Exactly. And he believed that the Catholic Church offered a framework for doing just that.
A framework that acknowledged the limits of human reason while also affirming the importance of revelation and the role of faith.
He talks about this in Caminos para Roma. He discusses the development of what's called dialectical theology, which can sound a little intimidating, but it's basically about emphasizing God's otherness, the idea that we can't fully grasp God with our limited human minds.
And he saw this emphasis on the mystery and transcendence of God as a corrective to the tendency in liberal Protestantism to try to rationalize God.
And trying to make God fit into a neat little box.
To domesticate God. And he felt that ultimately diminished the power and the awe of religious experience.
It takes away the mystery.
Yeah. So for Carpeaux, faith wasn't about reducing God to something we can easily understand. Right. It was about recognizing the vastness, the mystery.
Of the divine.
And approaching it. Humility and awe. And he saw the Catholic Church as providing a space for that kind of encounter with the divine.
Yes.
A space where both faith and reason could flourish.
He saw this reflected in the church's art and architecture.
Oh, yeah. He talks about how the great cathedrals are like compendiums in stone, visually representing the vastness and complexity of Christian theology.
He saw them as expressions of faith, made tangible.
But he also critiques what he saw as a deformation of the soul in art, especially in the centuries leading up to his own time. What did he mean by that?
By deformation of the soul, he meant art. That focused solely on outward beauty or technical skill while losing sight of its deeper spiritual meaning. He felt this was a symptom of the broader spiritual crisis in the modern world, a crisis that was reflected in the art of the time.
So he's not saying that beauty or technical skill are bad.
No.
But he's concerned about art becoming purely superficial.
Devoid of any connection to the transcendent, to the divine.
Losing its soul.
Exactly.
And he felt that this led to a kind of emptiness.
This sense that art had lost its power to inspire, to uplift, to connect us to something beyond ourselves.
But he wasn't entirely pessimistic about the state of the arts, was he?
No. He saw a glimmer of hope in what he called the Catholic revival in the arts. During the early 20th century, he saw artists like the poet Stefan George and Hugo von Hofmannsthal in Germany, and novelists like Joris Karl Huysmans and Paul Claudel in France as trying to reinfuse art with spiritual meaning.
So for Carpeaux, art had the potential to be this bridge back to the transcendent, a way to awaken the soul to its deeper longings, to remind us that there's more to life than what we can see and touch.
And he saw this revival in the arts as a sign that the human spirit wasn't entirely lost in the wasteland of modernity, that there was still this hunger for something more, this yearning for the divine.
And this yearning, this desire for something beyond the material world was ultimately what drew Carpeaux back to the Catholic Church. He saw the church as this beacon of hope in a world that had lost its way.
A source of meaning and purpose in an age of anxiety and uncertainty.
And his return to the church, it wasn't just a matter of intellectual ascent.
No.
It was a deeply personal journey, a transformation of his whole being.
He describes this transformation in detail in Caminos para Roma, talking about his struggles with doubt, his gradual rediscovery of faith, and his ultimate decision to embrace the Catholic Church as his spiritual home.
And he even talks about how his scientific background, which initially seemed like an obstacle to faith, actually helped him appreciate the beauty and order of the universe,
and wonder,
which he saw as evidence of a divine creator.
Exactly.
So for him, science and faith weren't contradictory.
No,
they were complementary.
They worked together.
Science could illuminate
certain aspects of reality,
and faith could provide a deeper understanding of the meaning and purpose of life.
A more complete picture.
Yeah. So for Carpeaux, the return to Catholicism wasn't a rejection of reason or the modern world. It was about finding a way to integrate the best of both worlds.
To reconcile faith and reason.
Tradition and progress.
The individual and the community.
Yeah. He was looking for wholeness.
And he believed that the church offered a path to that wholeness.
A way to live a life that was both intellectually stimulating and spiritually fulfilling.
And that vision of wholeness is something that resonates with many people today, even those who may not share Carpeaux's religious beliefs.
Because we're all searching for that sense of wholeness in our own way.
In a world that's often fragmented and confusing.
And in our next segment, we'll explore how Carpeaux's insights into faith, tradition, and the human condition can inform our own search for meaning in the 21st century. So we've been tracing Otto Maria Carpeaux's journey, this journey back to the Catholic Church. And it's a story that, might seem very specific to his time, but I think there are some enduring insights in Caminos para Roma that really resonate even today.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that makes his work so relevant is that he was grappling with questions that are still very much alive in the 21st century.
Like what kinds of questions?
Questions about the role of faith in a secular world, the search for meaning, in an age of, constant technological advancement, this tension between tradition and progress, the deep human need for connection and belonging.
Yeah, these are themes that we all grapple with in one way or another.
You do.
And he really challenges us to think critically about the assumptions of our own time. He forces us to look beyond the surface.
To peel back the layers.
And examine those deeper currents that are shaping our world.
He was so good at that. I mean, he had this depth of knowledge and this clarity of thought that are really remarkable.
Yeah.
I mean, he's deeply familiar with the intellectual trends of his time, and he was able to analyze them with such sharpness and insight.
Yeah. And his insights are still relevant today.
They are.
He wasn't just a critic of modernity, though. He was also looking for a way forward, a way to build a more humane and fulfilling future.
He was an optimist at heart.
And he believed that the Catholic Church offered a framework for doing just that.
He saw it as a source of wisdom and guidance, a community that could offer support and meaning in a world that often felt fragmented and alienating.
So he wasn't just talking about the church in a purely institutional sense. He was talking about the lived experience of faith, the transformative power of belief.
To shape our lives.
Yeah.
To connect us to something larger than ourselves.
To something transcendent.
Exactly.
And he saw this transformative power, not just in the lives of individuals, but also in the potential for the church to be a force for good in the world.
Force for change.
To promote justice, to care for the poor and marginalized, to work towards a more peaceful and harmonious society.
He had this vision
of
a world transformed by faith.
And I think one of the things that strikes me about Carpeaux is his intellectual honesty. He wasn't afraid to ask those tough questions.
He was fearless.
To wrestle with doubt. To challenge his own assumptions.
And he invites us to do the same.
He does. To be active participants in the search for truth. To engage with ideas that might challenge our comfort zones.
To be willing to step outside of our own little bubbles.
To be open to the possibility that we might be wrong.
That's so important, especially today.
Especially in our time, when it's so easy to get caught up in echo chambers.
And filter bubble.
And to surround ourselves with people who already agree with us.
Who just reinforce our existing beliefs.
Carpeaux reminds us of the importance of engaging with different perspectives, of being willing to listen to those who hold different views.
To really listen.
Even if we don't agree with them.
Even if it makes us uncomfortable.
And he does so not with a sense of judgment or condemnation, but with a spirit of curiosity and a genuine desire to understand.
We want to build bridges.
Not walls.
Exactly.
And he also challenges us to think about the role of tradition in our lives. Not tradition as blind adherence to the past, but tradition as a source of wisdom and guidance, a connection to the accumulated experience of generations who have come before us.
He saw tradition as a living, breathing thing, something that evolves and adapts over time, while still retaining its core values and principles.
A living tradition. And he believed that the Catholic Church was the institution that had most faithfully preserved and transmitted that tradition.
Making it such a valuable resource for navigating the complexities of modern life.
The compass.
In a sea of uncertainty.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Otto Maria Carpeaux's journey back to Catholicism, I want to leave you with a few questions to ponder. What aspects of our contemporary world might Carpeaux find encouraging? What aspects might he find concerning? Or his critiques of modernity? Still valid today, how might his insights into faith, tradition, and the human condition inform our own search for meaning and purpose in a world that can often feel fragmented and disorienting?
I think Carpeaux would be the first to encourage us to grapple with these questions, honestly and thoughtfully, to be open to new insights, and to never stop searching for truth, whatever it may lead.
And this deep dive has only scratched the surface of his complex and thought-provoking work. So I encourage you to explore Comenius par Roma for yourselves and see where your own paths to Rome might lead.